As I was like reading about them and about their history and stuff, I was just reminded that like this era, I think this is maybe my favorite era of Soviet history, which is the Thaw. So like the late or the 50s to 60s.
Wait, why is it called the Thaw again?
It's called the Thaw because so Nikita Khrushchev was the general secretary during this time, and he became general secretary in 1953 when Stalin died. This period of time is known as the Thaw because basically, like, under him, reforms, like, basically, like, a process of reforms that were known collectively as, like, de-Stalinization started to take place.
Oh, right. Okay.
So yeah, things were, like, a little bit more lax in terms of censorship and openness to other cultures, and, like, there's, like, some World Fair-esque things, Olympics, all that stuff was sort of, like, more slightly more open and more integrated within the country to a degree in terms of censorship in art, and outside also with like relationships with other countries. But it's not like it was just like straight up. It was like it was a matter of degrees, and then that was sort of like reversed after Khrushchev under Gorbachev. A famous, I need my fact checker, book, I think, that like sort of the term the Thaw was coined from the title of this work of art. So people didn't just like make it up.
Right. They weren't like, we're thawing right now.
Yeah. Hey, what does this feel like? It feels like a thaw. But it was about the book. What I believe is a book is about this time period. And things like for example, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is a very famous book. That have you heard of that?
No.
So it was published in like I want to say 61, 62 maybe. I'm just guessing. I'm pretty sure one of those 2 years. And it's like a day in the life of it talks about the Gulag.
Okay.
And so that's very important because like just the fact that was allowed to be published, it, like officially, right? Not in like samizdat, which we talked about.
Right. Okay.
Khrushchevki. Nikita Khrushchev. He comes into power in 1953. He's sort of like known for the Thaw. He is also known for Did you ever hear about him like banging his shoe at like a UN gathering? Okay, he was making a very performative speech, and he like banged his shoe on the table, and a lot of people in the West like only know him for that.
Okay.
He like took his shoe off and like hit it against the podium.
Like while he was like making a point, or like people weren't paying attention and he was like whacking it?
I think while he was making a point. I don't know. His aim was to rail against Western colonialism, like in Africa.
Okay.
So he had a good cause. Basically, he becomes general secretary in 1953. Then in 1954, so right away, he starts talking about housing as like the problem to address. What's like basically the issue is the war ended with like a lot of devastation of cities like in Europe, and basically so you have this combination of post-war shit show combined with an issue that had existed before the war in the Soviet Union, which is just like a lack of housing, urban housing specifically.
Basically, like people are like living in really unfortunate conditions because there's just they're putting like too many people in one house.
Too many people in like in too few houses were built basically before the war. Just to give a little perspective, in 1917, so at the year of the revolution, 80% of the population of Russia lived in villages. Like 80%. Okay. A lot of people. 1961 was the year that basically 50% of the population lived in cities. So that's when you can sort of call like a country like urbanized.
Right.
50% of the population living in cities. So that's a huge shift in not that much time. And so you have like industrialization, urbanization happening, then the war. And so yeah, basically the Soviet Union is looking at like a pretty severe housing crisis.
Okay, so they're dealing with like the same problem that a lot of countries were dealing with at that time.
Yeah, like a lot of countries, especially like in Europe, where like your whole everywhere has been destroyed by the war.
Well, yeah, that. But I was talking specifically about like the whole urbanization process was happening to like everybody, where like people were flooding into cities
Yeah,
from the
yeah,
countryside, and
yeah,
they were having to like build at a really alarming rate.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's also happening. One more thing, just for the background history, I mentioned de-Stalinization, but that's like just a really important thing to associate with Khrushchev. If this is the only time you're ever gonna hear about him or think about him, the other thing, the other thing that he's like well known for is that he gave what's known as the secret speech in 1956. So that's just 3 years after he started leading the Soviet Union. And the secret speech, it was at the 20th Party Congress, and it's called secret because that Congress was closed to like no guests or media or anything.
Okay.
And the speech was basically him denouncing Stalin publicly, which like is a big deal and hadn't nobody did that before.
Was he the one that like referenced the cult of personality?
Yes, exactly. So in the secret speech, he uses that word. Yeah, exactly. Or that phrase, the cult of personality. He basically says, like, Stalin had a cult of personality. Khrushchev, like, in that speech, also denounced the purges specifically.
Can you say in like one sentence what the purges are?
A period of time when thousands of people in the Soviet Union were arrested for, oh my God, I always forget what it's called. Not Trotskyite. Trotskyite? Sorry. Delete that. And I know you're going to include this because you always do that because you're a bitch. This time, delete it. The purges refer to basically a period in the 30s, the height of which was 1936 to 1938, peak, when thousands of people from the top of the party down through the ranks to regular people were arrested for basically being quote unquote enemies of the state, like some kind of treason charge that was fabricated in most cases. And there were a couple of like fake trials.
Okay, so this is the same thing we were talking about with Pussy Riot with
Pussy.
ship trials. Pussy Riot.
We talked about that with Pussy Riot. And basically, like, so Khrushchev denounces that time period. Though Khrushchev was there and he was playing his
Trumping
part.
along with them, yeah.
Just saying. Suddenly you're such a good guy. So as a result of like the secret speech, which the secret speech remains like officially secret. It's not actually published officially until like the end of the Soviet Union, 1989. But people start talking about it right away, et cetera, et cetera. And then like the Thaw, the sort of more open society, like kind of like people can point to the secret speech as when that started happening.